It's the director. Sorry for the benefit of the of posterity. I'll repeat myself. So this is the UCCS speaker series. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director of UCCS, and welcome as always. With this lecture, we're finishing up one of our 2019-2020 areas of focus, which is housing and homelessness. And without knowing precisely how Professor Blumenberg is going to go about it, I think many of us are aware that COVID aside, the underlying problem for California housing is too many people and too few homes. At the same time, it would be nice to decrease vehicle miles traveled and thus relieve some stress on our environment. So in this sense, jobs, housing, and transportation, which gets people between their jobs and their houses, are all pieces of the same puzzle. So to connect these pieces, we're pleased to have Professor Evelyn Blumenberg. Professor Blumenberg is director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and an urban planning professor within the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Her research examines the effects of urban structure, the spatial location of residents, employment, and services on economic outcomes for low-wage workers, and on the role of planning and policy in shaping the spatial structure of cities. She was honored in 2014 as a White House Champion of Change for her research on links between transportation access, employment, and poverty. She earned a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Berkeley and both a master's and PhD in urban planning from UCLA. And she'll be speaking today on the jobs housing balance in California cities, implications for transit ridership. So Professor Blumenberg, we're very pleased to have you with us. And I think we'll now turn the gavel over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in the speakers series. I very much wish that I could be in a room with all of you without jeopardizing our health, but things are what they are. And so Zoom has become our best friend these days. Like this, the first slide that you can see shows, I'm going to be talking about jobs housing balance in California cities. I'm going to tease out some of the implications of that relationship between jobs and housing relative to transit ridership. So what I'd like to do, the talk is going to be a little sort of wide-ranging this afternoon. I want to sort of lay out some of the context for this research, talk just a little bit about declining transit ridership in the state. I then will turn to the title slide, talk about the spatial location of jobs and housing in California, and then some of the implications of those arrangements for transit use. And then I'm going to end, it's really hard to give this talk. A lot of the research was done pre-COVID crisis. And so I am going to sort of provide some informed speculation about all of these relationships in the context of the COVID crisis. And so that's what I'm going to try to do in the next, half hour or so. Okay, so let me start with talking just a little bit about declining transit ridership in California. So there has been, even before COVID, there has been a tremendous amount of concern from transit agencies, from MPOs, the metropolitan planning organizations, and advocacy organizations about declining transit ridership. And so we at UCLA were asked to do a number of studies on this topic. And so that's what you see on this slide, the cover pages of 3 projects. So on the left is a project that we did for SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, looking at falling transit ridership in Southern California. In the middle, I guess maybe there's always this competition between LA and the Bay Area. So the middle is sort of a focus on what's going on in the Bay Area and whether the trends were different in the Bay Area than in the Los Angeles region. And then hot off the press on the right, the Transit Blues in the Golden State looks at LA and the Bay Area, but casts a much sort of larger window, and we look at some of these trends in other metropolitan areas and then for the state as a whole. I think the links will, the last slide has those links, and I think they'll be posted on the website as well if you want to take a deep dive into any of these reports. So on this slide, you see transit boardings over time. So from 2008 to 2018, you can see a slight dip in recent years, but potentially not too alarming. So it's transit riders, just in terms of total boardings, were relatively flat over this period. But it's this next slide that really provoked a lot of the concern that I just talked about, sort of the decline in per capita ridership in California. So you can see the big decline in Southern California, so in the larger LA region where I'm at. The gray line is for the US, so you can see that certainly California is not alone, that transit ridership has declined, transit ridership per capita has declined in the US as well. And so there are a lot of national studies looking at this sort of issue as well. Now, it is important to note that there's a good deal of variation in the decline by transit mode. And so that's what you see here on this slide. I've sort of bifurcated things by bus and by rail trips in California. And you can see that the rail ridership has really been propping up sort of ridership in California. And then you can see also the recent decline in rail ridership in recent years. Not all transit riders are the same. And so you can see here the median earnings of bus and rail. These are commuters, so not all users of transit. These are commuters, and you can see this big disparity in who it is who's riding sort of transit for work, right? So significantly lower for bus riders than for rail riders in the state. Bus riders tend to be poorer on average because many bus riders don't own automobiles, and they also tend to use transit for a lot of their trip making, not only for the commute. So just the overview on commute mode in California. So you get sort of a sense of what that mode share is. The yellow and the gray slices of the pie are public transit. So you can see transit has about sort of a 5% commute mode share, and the transit mode share is always higher for the commute than for sort of non-work sort of trips. And a lot, I think, probably the audience knows this already, a lot of what goes on, almost 75% of the mode share is solo driving. And I know there's a lot of effort in the state to shift just these sort of percentages that we see on this pie chart. In understanding transit and even understanding this topic of where jobs are located and where residents are, and thinking about that transit connection, it is really important to understand these asymmetries that are associated with public transit. And so what you see almost every place, certainly see it here in California, that a few people make most of the transit trips. A few cities and neighborhoods generate most transit trips, and a few operators and even lines on those operators carry most transit passengers. And so as a result, small changes in underlying patterns can make a very significant difference in those transit ridership trends that I just showed you. So let me just talk just for a few minutes about these asymmetries. So this is again, sort of looking at census data and looking at sort of transit use by commuters across demographic groups. And so the line that you see here on the graph is the average for the state. And you can see that transit use is higher among particular population groups. So recent immigrants, for example, African Americans, those who are in poverty, Asian workers, and youth, sort of younger adults as well. This graph is making a similar kind of point in a different way and using different data. So this graph relies on data from the National Household Travel Survey. So surveys that are dedicated to sort of thinking about sort of travel and transportation. The blue bars are the share of the population. The yellow are the share among transit users. So you can see here that sort of transit users are disproportionately in large metropolitan areas. Of course, that's where we do have a lot of transit and where transit can work well. Transit users are also disproportionately in high density neighborhoods, so neighborhoods with high residential densities. But they're also high, like I showed in the previous graph, among particular population groups. So those in zero vehicle households, low income households, the foreign born and young adults. And you see that in this graph as well. As I said in a previous slide, a few people make most transit trips. And so these data are suggestive. They're also from the National Household Travel Survey, and they focus on the greater LA region, so that SCAG region. And you can see that a very high percentage of those in the LA region, so close to 80%, use little or no transit, okay? We see about 20% are occasional riders, so they occasionally sort of take transit, either bus or rail, and about 2% of the population are frequent transit riders. So you see the asymmetries with respect to people and their use of public transit. And then a few neighborhoods generate most transit trips. And so on this graph, also using data from the National Household Travel Survey, in a previous project, we characterized all neighborhoods in the US. And that's what you see on the bottom. So there are some that are urban neighborhoods, but different kinds of urban neighborhoods. There's some that are suburban neighborhoods and different kinds of suburban neighborhoods, and then rural areas as well. And you can see here that transit ridership is very high in what we determined were old urban neighborhoods, so dense urban neighborhoods close to and in and around central business districts. But those neighborhoods make up 4% of all neighborhoods, or census tracts was our unit of analysis in the US. So high, relatively high sort of transit use, but in a very small percentage of neighborhoods around the country. And then this is to give the Bay Area some attention here. So this graph shows you, this map shows you that a few areas generate most trips. And so if you know the Bay Area, you can see kind of the big blob in and around San Francisco. So a lot of the trips that you see on transit, certainly in the Bay Area, are in and out of downtown San Francisco. And that's where you can see, these are kind of by operators, but you can see the big traffic by the width of those transit routes. And then we also see that a few operators and lines carry the most passengers. And so this underscores, this is also in the Bay Area, and underscores the map that you just saw, And here you see, again, sort of a lot of that traffic in terms of transit riders on BART, the Trans Bay in particular, sort of those routes in across the bay, in and out of downtown. So the huge growth that was sort of propping up sort of transit ridership, but also that worrisome decline since 2016. So are those three reports that I just showed you the cover pages of kind of go through the possible causes for the decline in transit ridership, and some of the variation, of course, across various regions and metropolitan areas in the state. I will not be able, this will be another talk, but I won't be able to go into sort of all of these reasons this afternoon, but I just kind of want to lay out the terrain so you get a sense of the context in which I'm going to be talking about the residential location of workers relative to jobs. So we divvied up these explanations in terms of internal and external factors. And so we looked at the decline in service quantity, so how much service is provided, the decline in service quality, so there's lots of concerns about the quality of service, in particular around sort of safety and homelessness issues, increases in fares, whether fares had anything to do with changes in transit ridership. And then we looked at a lot of external factors. I mean, one of the arguments that I've been making is that, you know, transit agencies get blamed a lot, yet the broader literature on the determinants of transit ridership suggests that it's really influenced by a lot of external factors that lie outside of the control of transit agencies. So we looked at whether gas prices had anything to do with sort of changes in transit ridership. We looked at neighborhood change in transit-rich neighborhoods that dovetails with a literature certainly on the role of gentrification, particularly around rail-adjacent neighborhoods. We looked at, as best as we could, tough on the data side of things here, but we looked at the growth of ride hail, so Uber and Lyft, and other sort of services like employer shuttles that play a role in the Bay Area. We looked at the impact of driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants, so AB 60, and you know I did much of the work on that. And then we looked at this last topic, on which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, on sort of changing residential location of workers relative to jobs in the state. And so I'm gonna turn to that right now and focus for the next few minutes around jobs and housing and how those are shifting. So I'm not the only one that has been interested in this topic. In fact, you know, potentially, I think that the media has led the way sort of on this. And so there's been a lot of articles, not only in California, but around the country, with a concern about sort of growing commute distances. And so that's what you see here, not a random sample, but a selection of some of these articles here in California. A part of these stories certainly is a concern about affordable housing. And so you could see reasonable rent, the role of reasonable rent payment, the lack of affordable housing, struggles with affordable, finding an affordable apartment as the consequence for a 6-hour commute. So lots of focus on affordable housing. And then also you see substantial sort of mentions to this notion of super commuters. So commuters that are traveling very far, taking a long time, increasingly sort of long distances, getting to their places of employment. And that's reflected in these media reports as well. I understand that this talk is a part of a series that is focused on affordable housing, as we should be focused on concerns around affordable housing. And so this graph just simply sort of underscores that. The blue line is median house sort of value. The red line is median gross rent on this. And you can certainly see the dip around the Great Recession, although not much of a dip with respect to rents. And then you can see this huge ramp up in both housing and rents in recent years. It is important to note that there is a good deal of variation across metropolitan areas in the state. So this is not all metropolitan areas, but a selection of them. The blue bars are the home value, the dots are the median rent. And you can see, I guess, if we're, kind of summarizing what's on this graph, you can certainly see, the higher sort of rents and home values in the metropolitan areas along the coast, and the lower home values and rents inland. So I was interested in sort of thinking about two research questions. And by the way, this research is ongoing, so we're sort of developing this work as we speak. But for the purposes of this afternoon, I'm going to focus on these two research questions. The first is, are housing prices pushing workers to live further from where they work? And then the second, if so, what are the implications for commute distance and residential location in transit-rich neighborhoods, or the implications for thinking about public transit and public transit use, which is why I started with that larger research project. So just a few words about research design. So we used data from the longitudinal employer household dynamics origin and destination employment statistics. It's a mouthful. Loads data. So it's think a giant matrix, sort of where it is that people live and where it is that people work. For this talk and this research, we aggregated these data for cities in California. So cities in which we had data for California in two time periods, 2002 and 2015. And then we looked at changes in job housing across all California cities for the 2 years. We took a look at some of these changes by city type. So cities that were housing rich relative to employment, cities where there was a reasonable balance between jobs and housing, and cities that were employment rich. And so you'll see a little bit of that in the data. And then we did a statistical model. Again, cities are a unit of analysis to predict the sort of relative self-containment of California cities. And again, with a sort of focus on sort of changes in affordable housing. And then we make this link to sort of changes in commute distance and the characteristics of the neighborhoods in which workers are living over time. So this map shows all the cities that were included in our analysis. So the big cluster in the Bay Area and LA, and then you can see all the way through the valley and elsewhere. Let me talk just a moment about kind of these relationships between income, residential location, and commute sort of distance in general. So households tend to make trade-offs between how much they're willing to pay for housing, so their housing costs, and commute distance, which has an out-of-pocket cost, but it also has a time cost as well. So the literature suggests that higher income households tend to live in large houses and on big lots in outlying neighborhoods, and will tend to have, in order to do that, will tend to have sort of longer commutes to jobs. But certainly, we have seen a recent trend where higher income households, largely white households, some younger households, are increasingly likely to live in downtown neighborhoods. With respect to lower income households, on average, they tend to travel shorter distances than higher income households. They're less likely to have automobiles, and they're more likely to live in dense urban areas where they can travel by public transit. So if they don't have a car, they tend to live in areas where transit can work for them and reasonably work for them. And because of this, on average, they tend to spend more of their income on housing and less on transportation. Okay, so now let me just go through some of the measures. I'm going to just show you some graphs in a minute, but let me go through some of the measures that we use. So one is sort of, just thinking about the characteristics of cities. So the number of jobs, regardless of where workers live, what's gone on with jobs in cities over time. The second is the number of employed residents. So what's going on with workers, the number of workers, again, regardless of where they work, what's going on. And this clearly parallels changes in the total population. Okay, so characteristics of cities. The second is this notion of a potential jobs housing balance. And so here we think about the ratio of jobs to employed residents. Okay, so what does that look like in California cities? And then finally, we're interested in thinking about the actual jobs housing balance. And so here we actually look at three measures. So we start by looking at locally working residents. So these are residents who work in the same city in which they live. And then kind of flipping this on its head, we're interested also in locally residing workers. So these are workers who live in the same city as they work. And then to put this all together, we have this self-containment or an independence index. And so in the numerator, it's these internal trips. So, workers who live and work in the same city. And then the denominator are these external trips. So either into or out of a city. Okay, so what did we found? So we see over this time period an increase in both jobs and in employed residents. So the median number, and again, think cities are a unit of analysis here. We found that the median number of jobs in cities increased by about 22%. The median number of workers increased by about 10.5%. And so that ratio of jobs to employed residents also increased by just under 2%. Well, what about that linkage between where jobs are, where workers live? So with respect to both of those measures, we found a decline in the median percentage of locally working residents, and also a decline in the median percentage of locally residing workers. Okay, I know the language is a little cumbersome here. But in net, sort of putting it all together with this sort of independence index, we found that declined as well. So over time, fewer workers are living and working in the same city. And on the right, we took a look just to kind of see if we sort of squared up with the larger literature. We actually looked at what that index was for lower wage workers and higher wage workers. And unfortunately, we can't produce something like this over time for workers by wages, because the data are not adjusted for inflation. So that's an unfortunate part of sort of using these data. But you can see, just as I kind of laid out, lower wage sort of workers and jobs are more self-contained. They're more likely to live and work in the same city compared to higher wage workers. And so you can kind of think about it conceptually, even if, let's say, we'll talk about San Francisco, let's say someone is working at a fast food restaurant in San Francisco, they decide they want sort of lower cost rent, they move someplace else. It is very unlikely that that worker is going to commute back into San Francisco to work at a fast food restaurant. They're going to find a new job in an outlying area. That's less likely for higher wage workers. They're more likely to commute back in, for example, to to downtown for their job. So as I mentioned, we were kind of interested in focusing on the sort of housing sort of element of this. And so we looked at housing rich cities, cities that were balanced in terms of housing and employment rich cities. And we found that the share of locally working residents declined the most in employment rich cities, where housing prices were the highest as well. So potentially, the headlines of those articles that we talked about are real. They're based in some of the dynamics that are happening in the state. And then we further test this. So you might say, well, there are many other factors that might predict whether someone works and lives in the same city. One might be potentially just how large the city is. So I'm not going to go through this model, but again, cities were the unit of analysis. We used the data to control for other kinds of factors that might help predict whether someone lives and works in the same city. And this is what we found. We found that cities with higher housing costs have a lower independence sort of index, so fewer people that live and work in the city, that this relationship has grown over time along with housing prices. And then in two of the models that you see here, we actually control for the major urban regions in the state. We still find that housing prices still have that same relationship. They have a negative relationship to how how independent or self-contained that city is, although it doesn't increase over time. And this likely reflects the role of some of these major urban areas in helping to explain this relationship. And so again, some of those urban areas have very high housing costs. So what about sort of commute distance? So we used the data and actually sort of ran those origins and destinations through the network, so we could estimate what the likely commute distance would be. And so on this graph, you see the change in commute distance between 2002 and 2015 by those sort of city types that I talked about. In general, commute distances increased in California, period, regardless of the type of city in which you live. Median commute distance increased by almost 2 miles between 2002 and 2015, so a 16% change. And the commute distance increased fastest in employment-rich cities. Again, another layer of evidence about sort of what is going on. So let me tease out some of the implications for sort of transit use, and then sort of turn to my sort of comments about the current crisis that we're in. The decline in self-containment is likely, we conclude, a contributing factor in helping to explain the downturn in transit ridership. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to take this out of context. You know, going back to my previous slides and the 3 reports that we produced, there are a lot of explanatory factors, and this is potentially one piece. Unfortunately, the data that we use for this study, they're not associated with information on travel mode, so we can't look at that directly. But even if workers who live increasingly distant from their places of employment, and so that's what we find in our analysis, even if they use sort of transit to get to work, they're likely to live in environments where for all their other trips, they will likely be using an automobile. It's in a dispersed environment, which will make it very difficult for them to be using transit for trips to get to the grocery store or, you know, take their kid to childcare. And transit mode share is highest for the commute, but we need to think about the fact that most transit trips are not taken for commute purposes. So we find that changes in the composition of transit users and trends in automobile ownership are suggestive of this relationship, the sort of growing commute distance and the growing distance between where workers live and where their jobs are. So one sort of data point that is suggestive is to look at the decline in occasional transit riders in California. So that here we're drawing once again on data from the National Household Travel Survey. We see in the orange sort of parts of the bars a decline in the percentage of occasional transit users. We also see an increase in choice riders, so higher income riders taking longer distance transit trips, largely for work. And the percentage of transit dependent riders has remained approximately the same in California. We also see a decline in zero vehicle households in California. So more households have automobiles. And if you look, you know, on the left is California, on the right are the you know, 4 metropolitan areas. And so you do see that sort of decline in, you know, that is fairly wide, you know, sort of in California. The one exception really is the San Francisco Bay Area, where the percent of zero vehicle household has remained rather flat if you look at the yellow line on the graph to the right. And these are data from the American Community Survey and the census. And so part of what we did, it's in the report that we produced for Caltrans, is we looked at what effect increased vehicle access sort of had. And it really, it looks like it had a very large effect, in California, in sort of Los Angeles, and potentially, at least in recent years, less of an effect in the Bay Area. So let me, I just want to end with a few thoughts about all of this with respect to the COVID crisis. And here I'm really sort of speculating. So it's very hard to, you know, I showed you the graphs about transit riders during the period in which we studied transit ridership, and during this period, certainly there's been a dramatic decline in the use of transit. So in this was in the Washington sort of Post. The U.S. public transit finds a new level 70% below the old one, for many reasons that we are well aware of. But also, we have some short-term protections, both in terms of income and housing. So we have the CARES Act, you know, so, you know, payments to households. We have a federal moratorium on foreclosures, protections for tenants in federally subsidized or federally backed housing. We have some local moratoriums on evictions for non-payment of rent and rent hikes and renter relief. And I want to be clear, you know, some households are certainly falling through the cracks in all of this, okay? But it is important to note that there are some short-term sort of protections, and that things would have looked substantially worse. And you can see the data on the graph to the right without these protections. But there are potential long-term effects that we ought to be deeply concerned about. And I've raised these as sort of questions, and questions related to thinking about where workers live and where they're working. So in terms of residential location, you know, clearly there's a question about whether at some point they lose their housing due to the inability to pay rent. There's a question related to higher income households. Will they continue to move out of dense urban areas in response to concerns about density or overcrowding? So I'm sure many of you saw this map that was in the New York Times, and so you can see it on the top right, about the richest neighborhoods in New York emptying out. And that was not the case in low income and minority communities around in the New York metropolitan area. With respect to employment, there's this question of, you know, households that work from home. You know, how many are going to continue to work from home as this crisis evolves, and even post-crisis, what will that sort of look like? And then finally, can transit agencies provide enough service and implement safety measures that allow for socially distanced travel? And I know that the transit agencies are grappling with this and in desperate need of funds to make this sort of happen. So in terms of transit implications, I would suggest, you know, again, if we don't intervene, my last slide is about our interventions, but if we don't intervene, it's likely that lower income households will, if they're evicted, will move to worse neighborhoods and housing. And if they don't have a car, it's likely that they're not going to be moving to outlying areas. They're going to be moving to worse neighborhoods and worse housing in central city areas where they can still get around using public transit or walking or biking. It is likely that we will see an increase in work from home, and that's going to largely be among higher wage workers who have jobs that will enable them to work from home. And we've seen a big increase. It's still a small percentage of all workers, but we've seen a big increase in the percentage of individuals that work from home over time. Higher income households are going to use vehicles, even if they had used transit previously, for concerns about their health and safety. And lower income households without cars are going to have two choices. They're going to have a choice to decide not to work, which would have devastating economic consequences for them and their households, or they can decide to use transit and risk sort of their health and exposure for them and their families. So unless we do a great job of intervening, these are the potential sort of outcomes. And I think that finally, what we're going to see is that transit ridership is going to grow increasingly poor. So riders are going to be increasingly poor because it's those that have the fewest options, both in terms of transportation and in terms of their jobs, who will be on transit. Unless, and this is the sort of the I can't end on that slide, unless we intervene, and we need to intervene. And now there's lots of policymakers and organizations and communities working on this. One, I think, is that it's really important in thinking through this and a role for transit or a role for living in dense urban neighborhoods, to distinguish between density and overcrowding. So there are plenty of dense places in the US and certainly internationally that are highly dense where COVID infections are relatively low, right? So what we see is problematic is overcrowding. That may happen in housing. It may happen on sort of transit, cars as well. But we really need to distinguish between the two. I think it's essential, and the research on jobs and housing underscores this. It's essential that we increase and protect sort of affordable housing. That's a key piece to all of this, in general, but also linked to transit and transportation. We need to allow households to live close to jobs if they choose, and currently many households cannot do that. And as I mentioned, it is really important to address overcrowding in housing as well. And then finally, we need to provide additional transit service, particularly in dense urban areas, and particularly bus transit, which is, sort of making that full loop. The bus transit riders are the ones that are most likely to continue using transit through this crisis and have the lowest wages and household incomes. So I'm gonna, and finally, I think to make all of this happen, one last point is I think we need to think about the automobile. So we need to use pricing, congestion, parking to regulate driving, that we can't put all that heavy burden on transit agencies. Transit service, transit ridership, and boosting both of those are going to be essential. It's going to be essential to regulate driving, and pricing is the way to do that. So thank you very much. And these are the links to the transit reports that I presented at the beginning of my talk. And I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Professor Blumenberg, for just an excellent talk today. And so we will be moving forward with our Q&A. And so Brooke will go ahead and